The hall was already buzzing with voices when the quiet girl walked in that evening. It was a small community center, nothing fancy, just rows of chairs and a well-used wooden stage that had seen many school events over the years. People from the neighborhood were moving around, greeting each other, adjusting seats, and getting ready for the talent show that happened once a year. For most people, this was just a small local event, something to fill a weekend. But for the quiet girl, it felt like the biggest moment of her life. She stepped inside slowly, almost unnoticed. She always moved like that, soft footsteps, careful breathing, no sudden gestures. She never tried to draw attention, and because of that, nobody really looked at her twice. She carried a small notebook in her hand, the same notebook she always kept close. Its pages were filled with scribbles, music lines, notes, and tiny ideas she wrote whenever inspiration hit her. It was her safe space, the place where she hid everything she could never say out loud. The hall was colorful with banners and lights, but she didn't look at any of it. She just chose a seat in the second row, close enough to see the stage clearly, but still hidden behind a group of parents, talking loudly about their kids' performances. She was dressed simply the same way she always did, no flashy colors, no bright accessories. Nothing that could make people turn their heads around her. The noise kept rising. A group of students laughed loudly in the corner, practicing some kind of dance routine. A boy was tuning his guitar on the far side of the room, plucking the same string again and again. Another girl, wearing a sparkling dress, was rehearsing her lines for a dramatic reading. Everyone seemed excited, nervous, busy, yet full of life. The quiet girl didn't join any group. She stayed seated, quietly flipping through her notebook, reading the music she had written months ago. She knew it by heart, but looking at it somehow gave her strength. She ran her fingers lightly over the notes on the paper, almost like touching a memory. A sudden laugh from behind made her look up for a moment. Two teens were whispering while pointing toward the stage. One of them said, "Do you think everyone will be good tonight?" The other one shrugged and replied, "Well, some people probably shouldn't even try." They laughed again. Not realizing their voices carried farther than they intended, she looked away, not wanting to hear such things. She knew those comments weren't about her specifically, but they still made her chest tighten. She had always heard similar things before, people thinking she was too shy, too quiet, too plain, too invisible to have any real talent. She never argued back. Instead, she let her music speak for her. That was her way of surviving the noise of the world. Her heart was beating fast. Not because she was scared, but because she had been waiting for this moment for so long. She knew that once she touched that piano, everything inside her would finally have a voice. The host began calling people backstage to prepare for their turns. Performers stood up one after another, going toward the side of the stage. The quiet girl stayed seated until she heard her name. A gentle, slightly shaky voice from the host called it out. She felt a strange wave of calm wash over her. She closed her notebook carefully, held it against her chest for a second, and then placed it on the chair before standing up. A few heads turned. Not because she was famous or known, but because she was the only one who stood up at that moment. Some people stared for a second, trying to remember if they had seen her before, but most quickly lost interest and continued talking. She walked toward the stage with small, steady steps. There was nothing dramatic about her movement, no confidence-filled stride like the showy performers before her. She simply walked like she always did, quiet, unnoticed, but determined. When she reached the steps leading to the stage, she paused. It wasn't hesitation. It was just her taking a breath, grounding herself. Then she climbed the steps and came into the lights. The room wasn't packed, but with all eyes on the stage, she suddenly felt the weight of every gaze. The audience looked at her with mixed reactions. Some looked curious. Others seemed confused, as if wondering what kind of performance a girl like her was going to offer. A few people whispered to each other, not in a cruel way but in a doubtful one, trying to guess if she would sing, speak, or play an instrument. She didn't rush. She walked to the piano placed slightly off-center, its wooden surface reflecting the stage light softly. It wasn't a grand piano, just an old upright model that had been used for years. But to her, it felt like the most important instrument she would ever touch. She pulled the bench slightly forward and sat. The audience continued their murmuring. People were tired from watching many acts already, and some didn't expect much from her. She could sense the doubts floating in the air around her, but she didn't let them in. Her hands rested gently on her lap for a moment. She looked at the keys, black and white, simple, yet holding endless possibilities for expression. She lifted her fingers, but before touching the keys, she closed her eyes. It wasn't a dramatic pose. She simply needed one moment to shut out the world. In that brief silence inside her mind, she remembered why she was here. She remembered sitting alone at home, playing this piece late at night. She remembered the day she wrote its beginning when she was feeling lost. She remembered how music had always been the only place where her heart could speak without fear. When she opened her eyes, something had changed, not in her appearance, not in her posture, but in her presence. She wasn't just a quiet girl anymore. She was someone ready to share a part of herself. She placed her fingers on the cold keys. The room grew a little quieter. The judges leaned forward slightly, still unsure but curious. Some kids in the audience sat back in their chairs, expecting something simple. Maybe a beginner melody, but she knew something they didn't the moment her fingers moved. The whole room would feel her heart. She took a small breath. It wasn't a dramatic inhale, just a calm, steady breath that settled her nerves and reminded her of why she came. Her fingertips pressed the first key. A soft, warm note filled the air. Not loud, not forced, just pure. It drifted across the silent room like the beginning of a story that everyone suddenly wanted to hear. Heads turned. Whispers stopped. Even the restless children fell still. For the first time that evening, the room stopped feeling like a noisy community hall. It felt like a place where something special was beginning. Her second note followed, then the third. Her hands found the rhythm they knew so well, and she started to play the melody that had lived inside her for months. People who had doubted her just moments ago now leaned forward unconsciously, drawn in by the honesty in her music. Her quiet nature seemed to disappear completely. At the piano, she wasn't shy or invisible. She was strong. She was expressive. She was someone who belonged there. More and more people turned their full attention to her. The ones who had underestimated her began to watch with interest. Some exchanged small, surprised glances. Even the judges, who had been writing notes or checking schedules a moment before, were now completely focused on her, and she hadn't even reached the powerful part of the piece yet, but none of that mattered to her right now. She wasn't playing for applause. She wasn't playing to prove anything. She wasn't trying to impress anyone who doubted her. She was simply playing because this was the one way she knew how to share a piece of her soul. And in that moment, the whole room was finally listening. The moment her fingers touched the keys, something inside her shifted. Just a few minutes earlier, she had been sitting quietly among the audience, unnoticed and unimportant to most people. But now, sitting at the piano, she felt a kind of power she rarely felt in her everyday life. It wasn't the kind of power that came from confidence or fame. It was the gentle power of someone who finally found a place where she belonged. As the early notes of her song floated through the hall, people began to react in their own ways. Someone in the back straightened up in their seat. A mother whispered something to her child, but stopped when the child quietly told her to listen. Even those who usually lost interest quickly were suddenly quiet, as if something delicate was unfolding and they didn't want to miss it. But what the people didn't know was how much this moment meant to her. They didn't know the hours she had spent practicing alone after school. When the house was silent and the world outside seemed too loud for someone like her, they didn't know that playing the piano wasn't just a hobby for her. It was something she leaned on whenever she felt invisible, whenever people dismissed her because of her quiet nature, or whenever she struggled to express her feelings through words. She had always been the one who blended into the background. Teachers rarely heard her speak. Classmates hardly remembered her name. At family gatherings, she mostly listened while others talked. She never complained about it because she didn't mind being quiet. But sometimes when the world grew overwhelming, she wished she had a way to show people who she really was inside. This piano piece was exactly that. As the melody continued, Her hands grew steadier. The earlier trembling had disappeared. Her fingers danced across the keys with a sense of purpose that surprised even her. She wasn't thinking about the audience or the judges anymore. She wasn't worried about their expectations or doubts. She was living fully inside the music, letting it guide her note by note. The hall's atmosphere slowly changed. The noise and chatter from before had completely faded. People weren't whispering anymore. They were simply watching, listening, absorbing the emotions rising from each key she touched. The glow from the stage lights made her look even smaller, but the sound she created felt bigger than the room itself. One of the judges, an older man with glasses, lowered his pen and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. He blinked a few times, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Before this, he had looked tired and uninterested, tapping his fingers on the table as the previous performers came and went. But now he was fully alert, listening as if the music carried something precious. Another judge, a woman known for being very strict, looked equally surprised. She watched the girl's hands moving across the piano with a thoughtful expression. Earlier she had seemed doubtful, even expecting a predictable, basic performance. Now she looked like she had just discovered something rare. Some people in the audience felt a strange tug in their chest. They couldn't explain it, but the music touched them in a way they hadn't expected. It wasn't a loud performance, and there was nothing showy about it. And yet, every note carried emotion, soft, honest, and real, but the quiet girl didn't see any of this. Her eyes stayed on the keys, and her focus never broke. She was lost in the melody she had created for herself months ago, a melody that came from evenings when she felt lonely, afternoons when she wished she could be understood, and mornings when she wondered if she would ever feel confident in front of people. Her piece moved from a gentle beginning into a slightly faster rhythm. The notes flowed like a river, sometimes calm, sometimes full of movement, sometimes rising with unexpected intensity. It was almost like a story told through sound, a story without words but rich with emotion. She remembered writing this part late at night after a long, difficult day. She had returned home feeling small, carrying the weight of things she wanted to say but never could. That night, instead of crying or talking, she had sat at her piano and let her fingers express everything she couldn't speak. That moment became the heart of her piece. And now, sitting on stage, she was sharing that chapter of her life with a room full of strangers. The faster part of the melody caught the audience by surprise. Some people leaned back a little, amazed at how smoothly she controlled the instrument. Her hands didn't hesitate. They moved with the kind of confidence that comes only from deep practice, emotional connection, and a quiet strength people rarely noticed in her. Someone in the front row whispered, "She's really good," their voice filled with surprise. Another person nodded slowly, unable to look away from the stage, but even with all the attention growing in the room, there were still a few who didn't understand what made her performance special. A teenager sitting near the aisle muttered, "She just looks so calm. It's weird seeing someone like her play this well." His friend elbowed him lightly and said, "Be quiet, just listen." The girl didn't hear any of that. All she heard was the music flowing through her fingers and echoing gently through the hall. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but at that moment, it didn't matter. She felt safe behind the piano, protected by the sound she created. Her breathing steadied. Her shoulders relaxed. A soft expression appeared on her face somewhere between peace and passion. She reached a part of the piece that required her to press the keys more firmly. The notes grew stronger, filling the hall with layered emotion. Some people in the audience held their breath without realizing it. They didn't want to miss even a second of this performance. The judges exchanged quiet glances among themselves. It was clear they hadn't expected this. It was clear nobody had expected this. Even the stage lights seemed gentler, as if softening themselves to match the mood she created. The audience didn't just hear the music, they felt it. The sound wrapped around them like a warm memory, reminding them of things they had forgotten. Childhood moments, dreams they once had, the beauty in small, quiet things. The quiet girl wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't performing for victory or recognition. She was simply offering the most honest version of herself, her emotions, her thoughts, her inner world through music, but ironically, that honesty was exactly what amazed people the most. The faster notes soon began to fade into slower ones again, like a gentle rain calming after a storm. Her fingers softened their pressure, her shoulders lowered. The song's energy shifted back into stillness, and as the melody slowed, the audience seemed to lean in even closer, not wanting the moment to end. Everyone in the hall could sense that the piece was reaching a meaningful part. The girl's expression softened even more. For a second, it almost looked like she was remembering something. Maybe she was thinking about the first time she discovered how much she loved playing. Maybe she was thinking about the moment she wrote the very notes she was now playing. Or maybe she was thinking about her future, how she wanted music to stay in her life forever. Whatever she was thinking, it showed in the way her hands moved. Her fingers glided gently across the keys, barely pressing but producing notes that touched the room like a whisper filled with emotion. Some people felt tears forming unexpectedly. It wasn't sadness. It was the kind of emotional pull that comes when a performance feels honest and meaningful. Even if the performer says nothing at all. The quiet girl didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could already feel the room changing around her. She could feel the stillness. She could feel the attention, even without seeing it. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, not because she spoke loudly, not because she tried to stand out, but because she shared something true from her heart. And as she approached the final portion of her piece, she let out the smallest breath of relief. She wasn't nervous anymore. She wasn't shy. She wasn't hiding. She was simply herself. And for the first time, the whole room truly understood the quiet girl behind the piano. The very first note she played had already changed the room, but as her piece continued and moved into its deeper section, the atmosphere grew even more intense. People who had walked into the hall expecting a simple community event now felt like they were watching something rare, something they didn't want to blink and miss. The quiet girl, who had barely spoken to anyone that evening, now had the entire hall listening to her without saying a word. Her fingers glided over the keys, with a natural grace that looked effortless from the outside. But she knew how many hours had gone into that ease. She had practiced this piece over and over again until her hands followed the path on their own, like they had memories locked inside them. Even then, she never imagined she would be playing it in front of so many people. She never imagined that people would actually be listening. The music seemed to reach a new height, a richer sound that filled every corner of the hall. The audience sat completely still. Even the ones who usually fidgeted during long performances were frozen in place. A little child in the front row, who had been restless earlier, now sat quietly with wide eyes. As if the music had wrapped him in a soft blanket, people began feeling emotions they didn't expect. Some sat with their arms crossed but gradually relaxed their posture without realizing it. Others leaned slightly forward, wanting to be closer to the sound. There was something in her melody that spoke to everyone differently. Some heard hope, some heard sadness, and some heard a kind of calmness they hadn't felt all day. The judges continued watching her closely. The older man with glasses had stopped writing completely. He rested his chin on his hand, nodding slightly at certain moments as if appreciating the small details in her technique. The strict judge kept her eyes fixed on the girl, occasionally glancing at the score sheet in surprise, as if she didn't expect someone so young and quiet to play with such emotion. But the quiet girl didn't see any of this. She was lost inside the music. Her hands moved, but her mind was filled with memories, some soft, some heavy, all part of the story she was telling through sound. She remembered sitting at home with the lights dimmed, letting her fingers wander across the keys after long days when she felt unheard. She remembered how the melody came to her slowly, almost like it wanted to comfort her. She remembered how the first few notes brought her peace when she needed it most. Now, she was sharing that comfort with a room full of strangers. The melody shifted again, moving into a part that was gentle and emotional. Her fingers touched the keys delicately, letting each note breathe before moving to the next. The sound was warm, almost like a soft conversation between her and the piano. People could sense the change, and their faces softened as they listened. A young woman in the audience wiped her eyes quietly. Not because the song was sad, but because it reminded her of someone she missed. An older man near the back sat up straighter and closed his eyes, letting the music pull him back to a memory he hadn't thought about in years. Music has a way of doing that, connecting people to moments they forgot mattered. The girl played on, unaware of the emotions she was stirring in the audience. She didn't need to know. She simply followed the rhythm that had lived in her heart for so long. The piano keys clicked softly under her touch, and her foot pressed the pedal gently, blending the notes into one warm sound. The piece reached a moment where the volume grew stronger. Her hands moved faster, but not in a showy or dramatic way, more like a wave rising naturally before breaking. Some audience members leaned forward, sensing something powerful coming. The sound grew fuller, richer, almost like a voice speaking clearly for the first time, and then it dropped again, soft, delicate, almost whisper-like. That sudden shift caught everyone by surprise. It felt like the music was telling a secret, something personal. People listened more closely, trying to catch every detail. Even the occasional creak from the old chairs stopped, as if the room itself didn't want to interrupt her. The quiet girl wasn't thinking about how the audience felt. She wasn't thinking about making an impression. She wasn't even thinking about the competition. She was simply telling the truth through her music. And sometimes, the deepest truths come from the quietest souls. As she continued, the wooden stage reflected the soft light around her, creating a warm glow that made her look smaller, but also somehow stronger. She didn't smile, but her expression was peaceful, almost like she was at home. Because in a way, she was. The piano had always been her safe place. The audience began to breathe differently, slow, controlled, almost synchronized with the rhythm of her playing. They didn't plan it. It just happened because the music carried them gently, like a story that keeps unfolding with every note. She was reaching one of the hardest parts of her piece. Her hands needed to move quickly and precisely. Any small mistake would be easy to hear. But she had practiced this section more than anything else. Late at night, early in the morning, whenever she needed to clear her head, this was the part she played. It was challenging, but it was also her favorite. Her fingers flew across the keys without hesitation. The sound grew brighter, filled with energy, but still controlled. The strict judge raised her eyebrows, impressed. The older judge tapped his finger softly on the table, following the rhythm. At the back, someone whispered, "Where did she learn to play like this?" Another person replied softly, "I don't know. But she's amazing." The piece began leading toward its emotional peak. Her hands moved in a blend of soft and strong notes, creating a sound that filled the hall with warmth. It was the kind of sound that made people forget about the coldness outside, their worries, their stress. It was the kind of sound that made people feel present in the moment. One of the stage workers, who had been busy adjusting props earlier, stopped in the doorway and listened. Even people who weren't part of the audience felt drawn to the quiet power of her music. As she approached the peak of her piece, her breathing grew a little heavier, not from fear, but from passion. Her shoulders moved slightly with each phrase, and her head tilted gently as if she were listening to the piano respond to her. The melody rose higher, fuller, brighter. People felt their hearts lift with it. The sound filled the entire hall. It was hard to believe that such strong emotion was coming from someone who barely spoke, someone who had walked quietly onto the stage with her head slightly lowered. The quiet girl had transformed into something else entirely, an artist who didn't need loud applause or bold confidence to make her presence known. Her music alone was enough. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the first real climax of the piece. It wasn't loud or explosive. It wasn't dramatic in the usual sense. But it was powerful because of its honesty. The notes blended in a way that felt like a heart opening up, finally free to show what it had been carrying. People felt it. They didn't need musical training to understand it. Emotion speaks its own language. Somewhere in the hall, someone let out a soft sigh. Others simply stared at her in awe. Even the ones who had underestimated her earlier now looked amazed, almost embarrassed for ever doubting her. As the peak faded into a gentle flow of soft notes, the hall grew even quieter. The music felt like a calm after an emotional storm, a comforting breath after a long moment of intensity. People realized something then: this wasn't just a performance. It wasn't just a talent show act. It was a story told through sound. It was the heart of a quiet girl speaking louder than words ever could. And as she played the last few gentle phrases, the audience felt something they rarely felt in everyday life. They felt connected to her, connected to the moment, connected to the feeling she poured into every note. The music softened, growing tender and slow. Her fingers moved lightly, almost floating on the keys. She knew the ending was coming, but she didn't rush. She let the final notes breathe, giving them space to settle in the hearts of everyone listening. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of emotion she had released. She pressed the final key. The sound lingered in the air like a warm echo, and the entire hall stayed frozen, unable to move or speak, completely stunned by what they had just witnessed. For a moment after she played the final note, the entire hall seemed to stop breathing. The sound had faded, the air had settled, but no one moved. It was as if the last note still hung in the space between the stage and the audience, refusing to disappear. The quiet girl, who had been pouring her heart into every key, kept her hands resting lightly on the piano, almost afraid to lift them in case the moment broke too quickly. She didn't know what to expect. She wasn't used to standing in front of people. She wasn't used to being watched. She wasn't used to having so much attention directed toward her all at once. Her chest rose slowly as she exhaled, calming the small tremble in her fingers. She finally lifted her hands from the keys and placed them gently in her lap. Still. No one clapped, not because they didn't want to, but because they were still stunned. Even the children, who usually clapped the second a performance ended, sat frozen in their seats with wide eyes. Some adults blinked as if waking up from a dream. Others leaned back slowly, almost overwhelmed by how strongly her music had affected them. Then, after what felt like the longest few seconds of silence, one person near the back began to clap softly. The sound echoed in the stillness like a raindrop hitting a calm surface. Then another clap followed, and another. Soon the whole hall erupted into applause that grew louder and louder until it felt like the room itself was shaking. Some people stood up instinctively, unable to stay seated after witnessing something so heartfelt and real. The applause wasn't just loud, it was filled with emotion. It was full of respect, surprise, admiration, and a kind of warmth that couldn't be faked. The quiet girl lifted her head slowly, surprised by the standing ovation happening right in front of her. She had never imagined anything like this. She had only wanted to share her music, the music that had always been her safe space. She never expected the whole room to rise for her. She tried to smile, but it wasn't a big smile. It was small, soft, the kind of smile that came from deep inside someone who wasn't used to being celebrated. She stood up from the piano bench slowly, her legs still feeling a little weak from the emotional intensity of her performance. She bowed gently, not too deep, just enough to show her gratitude. The applause grew even louder. The strict judge, who rarely showed emotion, was standing too. Her expression was softened in a way that surprised many people. The older judge with glasses was clapping with both hands, nodding as if saying, "Well done. Truly well done." The audience members who had earlier doubted the quiet girl, the ones who whispered and wondered whether she belonged there, now clapped the hardest. Almost as if trying to make up for their earlier judgments, the quiet girl looked around the hall for a second, trying to take it all in. She didn't know where to look, because everywhere she looked, she saw admiration. She wasn't used to attention, and for a moment, her heart raced, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that she had touched so many people through her music. As the applause slowly softened, but still stayed steady, the host stepped onto the stage with a stunned look on his face. He wasn't expecting a reaction like this either. He held the microphone but didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, watching the girl with respect. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth everyone in the hall could feel. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you witness something that reminds you why we hold events like this. Tonight, this young lady gave us a moment we will remember for a long time. The audience clapped again. The quiet girl lowered her head slightly, embarrassed but grateful. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do with so much attention. She simply bowed once more and stepped back from the piano as she started walking toward the side of the stage. Something unexpected happened. People didn't stop clapping. They didn't stop looking at her. They turned their heads to watch her leave the stage as if they wanted to hold on to the moment a little longer. When she reached the stairs leading down, she paused for a second, unsure if she should rush or walk slowly. She chose to walk naturally, keeping her small notebook clutched against her chest. She had left it on her seat earlier, but someone had placed it near the stage for her. She was relieved to have it back, as if holding the notebook grounded her in reality again. As she walked down the stairs, a woman near the front row leaned forward and whispered to her friend, "She doesn't even realize how amazing she is." Her friend nodded, still looking emotional from the performance. When she reached the backstage area, some of the other performers looked at her with admiration. A few kids who had been practicing dance routines earlier stared at her as if she were some kind of unexpected hero of the night. Someone said softly, "That was unbelievable." She didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled politely and looked down. She found a quiet corner backstage and sat for a moment, letting the familiar silence wrap around her. After being in front of so many people, the quiet felt comforting again. She breathed deeply, feeling the warmth of the applause lingering inside her like a soft echo, but she didn't get much time alone. A soft knock on the backstage door announced the arrival of the strict judge. The quiet girl stood up quickly, thinking she had done something wrong, but the judge raised a gentle hand to calm her. "You played beautifully," the judge said, her voice warm and sincere. It was the kind of compliment the girl never imagined hearing from someone so respected. "You didn't just perform, you shared something meaningful. That is rare." The girl lowered her eyes and nodded shyly. She didn't trust her voice not to shake if she tried to speak. The older judge soon joined them, adjusting his glasses as he walked in. "Young lady," he said with a kind smile, "your music reminded me of something I haven't felt in years. You have a gift. Don't ever hide it." Hearing that made her chest tighten with emotion. She wasn't used to praise, especially not from people like them. She whispered, "Thank you," barely audible. They didn't ask her where she learned to play. They didn't ask about her background. They simply admired her for what she showed on stage, her heart through music. When she stepped out of the backstage area afterward, some audience members were still gathered near the exit. They weren't waiting for their own families or friends. They were waiting for her. A few people stepped forward to tell her how her performance made them feel. One said it reminded them of their childhood. Another said it gave them comfort after a stressful week. Someone else said it inspired them to start playing music again. She stood quietly, listening, nodding, and offering shy smiles. She didn't expect any of this. She didn't think she had the power to move people. But hearing their words made her realize something important. Sometimes the quietest voice can have the strongest impact. As she finally walked outside into the cool evening air, she felt lighter than she had in a long time. The stars above seemed a little brighter. The night felt calm and peaceful. She held her notebook close to her heart and breathed in the cool air deeply. For the first time, she wasn't just a quiet girl who blended into the background. She was someone people would remember. Someone who had touched hearts. Someone who had shown that true expression doesn't need loud words, big gestures, or fancy appearances. All it needs is honesty. In that night, her honest music had amazed everyone. She walked home with a small smile, knowing that no matter what happened next, she had shared a piece of her soul with the world. And the world had listened.